Greetings, this is GBA 383 Business and Society, and this lecture is Introduction to Business Decision Making and Critical Thinking. And so what we're going to cover over the course of this week is an introduction to what it means to make a decision and what does this decision-making process actually look like. How does this then relate to the importance of using good critical thinking and then ultimately being able to make a good ethical decision. Because at the end of the day, as we're going to see in a few minutes, in order for us to be able to resolve ethical dilemmas, we need to be able to think critically and make good business decisions. So this will be just a highlight of the importance of making good decisions. I'm going to cover some of the things I think are the most important. Obviously, I have an entire course in decision making, so I could do an entire course on this, but clearly not going to do that for you all right now. But at least it's good to know the ground rules, what it means to make a good decision, so that's something that you all can understand and practice throughout the course. So how does decision making and ethics relate to each other? Ethics and ethical decision making really comes down to understanding the moral dilemmas that we face on a regular basis, particularly in a business organization, hence business ethics. And then from there, we need to reason through appropriately to come up with a good solution to our issues. And so in order for us to be able to make good ethical decisions and navigate ethical dilemmas, we need to understand the basics of how to make a decision, because this is a specialized concept when we think of decision criteria. There's a whole broad range of decision criteria that go into any decision, but specifically when we're dealing with ethical dilemmas, we need to be focusing on ethical decision making in that context. So once we understand the ethical parameters that we're dealing with, once we understand the rules of how to make good decisions, then we can combine these together using good critical thinking skills to be able to make good decisions. Okay, so let's dive into what is the concept of decision making. And ultimately, it's about having to choose between multiple feasible alternatives. Now, here's some of the challenges of decision making, right? We don't always have all the alternatives in front of us. So if we don't have all the alternatives, we are often making decisions with limited information, meaning we are not aware of what we don't know, if we don't dive into and explore and expand our horizons to find as many potential alternatives as we can. But we recognize, as we're going to see in a few minutes, we are very limited cognitively in what we are able to really comprehend in terms of the range of alternatives available to us. It's just natural. It's the way it is. We can try to do the best that we can to get more alternatives on board, but ultimately we are still limited by what we can, what is available and in front of us. So we're not always going to have all those alternatives. And it might be that the alternatives we have are good, but maybe the best alternative is one we haven't thought about. How do we increase the likelihood of better alternatives? Having more perspectives, more points of view, more experience involved in that decision-making process. So one individual making a really difficult decision is going to be very limited in what they have available in front of them to be able to make that decision. When we have teams making good decisions, as we'll see in a few minutes, that enables us to have much more information available to us and a wider range of options that we are going to be able to consider. Next, even though we may have a wonderful alternatives in front of us, they're not all equally feasible. Some of them are very easy to implement, some of them make perfect sense, and some of them are a little squirrely or a little unreasonable. It doesn't mean that they're not a potential outcome, it's not a potential alternative, but we have to recognize with any alternative there's a pro and a con to every alternative. No alternative is perfect. Every alternative at the end of the day is going to have trade-offs. So I can choose A, but it means B is not going to happen. Or I can choose B, but it means some of these other issues that I'm concerned about are not going to happen. So I have to decide, am I willing to make those trade-offs between option A, option B, option C, whatever it is, to ensure that I am maximizing the value of whatever it can be. Now, how do we decide then the criteria of choosing between A and B and C? Well, that's where we apply the ethical theories, which we'll get into as we get into the third week of material. We have to start considering what one ethical theory would say is the right decision and what a different ethical theory would say is the right decision. And as you will see as we start to go through and understand those ethical theories, that just because one theory says something's a good idea doesn't mean they will all agree that it's a good thing to do. Sometimes utilitarianism would say it's a good thing to do, and the justice approach would say it's not a good thing to do. So this is where we have to learn the application of critical thinking and these ethical theories and ethical decision making to be able to make a better decision. Lastly, the next thing is, what if it's a crisis and we don't have time to plan? Because many times when we're trying to make a decision, we want to have a plan in front of us. We want to have all the alternatives. We want to know what's feasible and what's not feasible. And if we're in a crisis where we have very limited information and we have a lot of time pressures on us, our ability to make a good decision and to plan is not going to be there. So we have to overcome a lot of cognitive bias when we're in a crisis to be able to make the best decision that we're able to make in analyzing and looking at what the alternatives are. Lastly, are our solutions always rational and logical? Now, you'll hear people talk all the time about, oh, keep emotion out of it and just be rational and logical, but what is rational and logical to me is not always rational and logical to you. And I know that is a hard thing for a lot of people to understand, but what matters to me and the way that I see the world is through the whole realm of experiences that I've had in my life. And you have a very different set of experiences that you've had in your life. And then what happens is you look at it and it makes perfect logical sense to do option A, but I look at it with different experiences and different points of view, and I might say, well, option B seems the most rational or logical. At the end of the day, we need emotions, believe it or not, to be able to make good decisions. That we can't really be rational or logical, because if we really were to take rationality and logic to its extreme, we know that when people don't have an emotional center to their brain, they can't make simple decisions, such as, should I choose a blue pen or a black pen? They literally cannot make that choice because the emotion center of the brain tells them, right, this will be a better thing. Emotionally, this makes better sense. So we need emotions to inform our decisions. Should all our decisions be based on emotions? No. And they shouldn't be the predominant criteria that we use to make decisions. But emotions, even if they're unconscious to us, are an important part of how we make decisions. It's important to recognize we don't always offer the alternatives. And even if we have alternatives, they're not always equally feasible. That in a crisis, we don't always have the luxury to plan and lay out all the alternatives and all the feasibility analyses out there. Sometimes we have to make a quick decision based on whatever information we have in front of us. And we have to learn how to stay grounded in being able to make those good decisions. And don't always assume that what might feel rational or just logical to you is going to be rational and logical to everybody else. So this slide represents what we consider to be the baseline process or flow of what it takes to make a good decision. You start out by identifying your problem, you define those objectives. What is it that we're trying to accomplish by making this decision? We're trying to decide what our market share should be, or we're trying to determine our budget for next year, or trying to make a decision about how to respond to a competitor's movement in the market. All of these things were going to push us to make a decision, but in order for us to be able to make the decision, we have to agree on what it is that we're trying to accomplish in the first place. So then it says to make a pre-decision. And what it means is, what does your gut sort of tell you to start with? What are some of the things you think you need to be considering? And then from there, with that after that pre-decision, when we kind of get a sense of what it is that we need to determine, then we have to start generating all those alternatives. And sometimes we'll have a broad list of alternatives, and sometimes we'll have a narrow list. When we're brainstorming, and you've probably heard that term, brainstorming, in other classes. You've probably done it yourself in school, at home with friends, brainstorming new ideas, creative ideas to solve problems, whatever the problem might be, whether it's what I should have for dinner tonight versus, what I'm going to do next weekend. We want to brainstorm and really open up and allow for all alternatives out there. When we're brainstorming, we should not be censoring our ideas. We should just throw the ideas out there, as weird or as outlandish as they might seem, and then from there we can start to sort out what's feasible and what's not feasible. And sometimes infeasible ideas may inform a more feasible idea. Like we might say, well, that's ridiculous. That probably won't happen. It's really not possible for that to happen given the parameters that we're dealing with. But can we modify that idea to make it more feasible? So don't censor out infeasible ideas to start with. The goal should be to put all the ideas out there and allow some of those sort of outlandish ideas to inform something that's more feasible. Once we generate those alternatives, then we have to evaluate them. And then we have to determine what is the most important criteria for our decision. How do we value it? When we think about this in the terms of ethical decision making, this is where we might look at all the alternatives and then we evaluate each alternative based on what the ethical lens would determine would be the right or ethical thing to do. Then, after we've done our analysis, we've figured out what variables matter, we've done the analysis based on those variables, we make a choice. Sometimes you just got to pull the trigger and make that decision. Then we implement the choice. We implement what it is that we made the decision to do, and then we have to evaluate it. And sometimes we made a good decision, and there are times when we're not. So that evaluation process has to be important, because as we evaluate, we go back to the process and go, did we identify the appropriate problem? Did we identify the correct objectives? Did we find good alternatives? Did we evaluate them appropriately? Any one of those variables could change by looking at our follow-up process and recognizing that, well, we made an assumption that was an incorrect assumption. And so the next time we make this decision, we won't make that same assumption. We'll make a different assumption, and that will help us to make a better decision down the line. And then ultimately, it's a cyclical problem, right? I mean, all of these stages get feedback from that follow-up loop, where it helps us to make adaptations as need be based on what we learned from our follow-up process. Generally speaking, there are 4 basic decision-making styles. Number 1 is a directive decision-making style. And someone who has a more directive style looks at a situation, they tend to make decisions fairly quickly, and they look at things in a very simple and clear solution. They also are not really good at broadening the number of alternatives that they're looking at, and they simply rely on, basic rules for decision making. Are there times when a directive decision making style makes sense? Absolutely. There are times when we want to be really quick to make a decision, usually when we have a limited amount of time, limited amount of resources, or we're in a crisis. And in that moment, a directive decision makes sense. It also makes sense when it's a fairly simple and straightforward problem. So we can make a directive decision because perhaps we have more experience with this issue. We have seen these scenarios before, and we know what is going to probably happen, high likelihood of happening. So we can make a very quick decision without having to go into a tremendous amount of analysis. The challenge is, of course, for someone with a directive decision-making style is that they have to recognize, and any of these decision-making styles, to be honest, you have to recognize that that directive style may not be appropriate for all scenarios. And so if you engage in a directive style, in every decision that you make, there are going to be times when it's going to be perfectly appropriate to do that and times when it is the wrong decision-making style to make given the situation. So remember what I said. A directive style is good when we have limited time or the decision is fairly straightforward. It's not very complex, in which case then a directive style makes the most sense. Next is the analytical style, and that analytical style is kind of like the opposite of that directive style, where a directive style doesn't do a lot of analysis. It keeps things fairly simple. The analytical style loves to problem solve, loves complex problems, loves to dive in and do research and explore alternatives, and this is great, except that not all decisions need to be analyzed like that, right? So the directive decision maker and the analytical decision maker kind of counterbalance each other. The analytical decision maker is really good at the complex problem. They dive in and they do the research, versus the directive decision maker says, well, this is a scenario where we really don't need to do a lot of research on it. We can dive in and we can make this happen quite readily. The last two decision-making styles are conceptual and behavioral. So keep in mind, right, we've already talked about directive, which is very quick decisions. They don't explore a lot of alternatives. Alternatively, we have the analytical, which counterbalances that with a lot of analysis. Now we're going to dive into the conceptual side, which is somebody who's really looking at creative problem solving. They come up with wonderful generating new ideas. They try to consider what is good outcomes, how do we balance the needs for people, but really conceptual is about the idea generation and how do we dive in and understand what are some really creative issues that might be out there. And that can combine beautifully with an analytical decision maker who then would take these wonderful ideas and analyze them in a more deep way to help that conceptual decision maker to make good decisions. So they can really support each other in that process. So the conceptual person, counterbalances the analytical by generating the lovely ideas, and then the analytical person can dive in and come up with solutions based on those ideas. So they ground them really nicely. And then lastly, the behavioral style is less concerned with what the solution will be, but more concerned with the process of how we manage it. So they're concerned about making sure that there's buy-in, that there are people that have a voice, that voice gets heard, that a behavioral style will always make sure it engages with meetings to make sure everybody gets an opportunity to have a voice, that everybody's perspective is considered in this process. And again, while a lovely idea, we don't always need to have buy-in with every decision that we make. Sometimes in a crisis, the last thing we want is this tremendous buy-in where everybody's voice gets heard. Sometimes we are going to need a directive decision maker that comes in and says, this is what we got to do, this is why we have to do it this way, et cetera, et cetera. So all four of these really can complement each other. And while it would be great if a person could exercise all four of these decision-making styles in their repertoire of tools that they can use to be a good leader, be a good manager, sometimes we really fall into a dominant space of being more behavioral, more conceptual, more directive, and more analytical in our styles, which is fine. Then the key for us as leaders, if I know I really fall hard in that analytical style and I don't really pay attention to what other people need, I might need to counterbalance and bring in somebody who I know is more behavioral that will help with making sure everybody's voice is heard, so that I know for the decision that we're making, a behavioral style will serve us so much better than a analytical style will or a directive style will, right? So my job as a manager is to know what my style is, but then it's also my responsibility to know when it's going to work and when I really need to flex my muscles and either use a different style than what would be my comfort zone, or bring in somebody to the team and to the decision-making um, um, core, to have somebody else with a different perspective help us make a better decision as a group or as an individual. All of those things work really nicely together.